We've now covered conception to birth, childhood, and adolescence, so the most logical progression is to move on to adulthood and old age. And these two are grouped together just because we're going over this again fairly quickly, but we're going to touch briefly on some of the important developmental concepts and ideas that are important for adulthood and old age considerations. So we might already know that as we get older, we see changes in cognitive function. As part of development, as we're growing and aging, we start seeing changes. And a lot of what we think about for when we get older is a decline in function. So as we get into our old age, we think about maybe we can't remember where things are, or maybe we have trouble remembering words, or we're not thinking as quickly. And although we do see declines in some of our functions, specifically things like fluid intelligence, which is our ability to perform mental operations, things like abstract and logical reasoning, solving spatial problems, those sorts of things, other types of function are going to be maintained or even strengthened as we get older. So as we get older, we have more crystallized intelligence. So this is our accumulated group of verbal skills and factual knowledge. As we have more experience in our lives, we have more base knowledge that we can fall back on. So we have a compensation of losing some of our fluid thinking, our ability to think on our feet, but we have more base knowledge to pull from, so it ends up not being as big of a detriment as it could be. And these declines that we talk about aren't necessarily a foregone conclusion. There's lots of research into ways that we can prevent or even slow the decline of some of these losses of function or reductions in function. So if we look at things like technology, that's something new that's becoming more and more common in our everyday lives. There's a common rhetoric that having our smartphones with us all the time sort of turns our brains to mush, that we can look everything up, that we don't have to remember anything. But there are also lots of uses with technology. We can use it for reminders, notes. If you can't remember the name of a song, there's an app for that. So having access to all this information isn't necessarily a bad thing, and if we learn to use it well, we can keep our functioning quite high for quite a long time. Things like playing video games or doing complex spatial tasks, even things like putting together puzzles, can all help slow decline in different cognitive processes. And mostly the idea here is, I've seen it referred to as use it or lose it for intelligence and our knowledge, where if you practice and use those skills, they tend to persist for longer. But if your everyday life doesn't use your cognitive abilities at all, if you live a fairly sedentary life, no new experiences, if you're not doing anything, then these declines happen a lot faster. So we can build up what are called cognitive reserves, which is our ability to sort of resist these declines. And we can build those up by educating ourselves, whether it's a formal education or just learning something every day that we want to learn something. Work experiences, again, being exposed to new situations, working and using our minds, as well as leisure activities. So doing things that you enjoy, and again, things that use different faculties, can help build up those cognitive reserves and slow decline with age. Now, in some cases, we see declines that are even more extreme than what we would expect to come with age. So we can talk very, very briefly about dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And though some decline in mental processes, mental faculties is expected with age, dementia is a major deterioration of brain function that goes above and beyond what you would expect with typical aging. And Alzheimer's disease is one of the main forms of dementia that we see, and it includes impairments in memory and language and our cognitive function. So it's a very widespread problem. And again, didn't mean to scroll there. We can talk at length about each of these different things, but I'm just making us aware that these are things that can happen, things that do absolutely affect older populations, though there are cases where dementia and even Alzheimer's disease can have early onset. So it's not just for older people, it's for most age ranges, but more commonly in the older population. Next on our whirlwind tour of adulthood and old age, we're going to talk again about attachment styles, but this time about adult attachment styles. So you're going to find a lot of parallels with what we had mentioned with childhood attachment styles, which looked at those infant caregiver attachments and how a child reacted when their mother left the room, when they interacted with strangers, and when their mother returned. So here we're looking at almost the same idea, but we're looking at how adults sort of match up or interact with romantic partners, as well as other kinds of attachments. So it's not all about romantic relationships. We just want to look at how people tend to interact with those who are important to them. And you'll find a lot of parallels here. So the first of our adult attachment styles is the secure or autonomous attachment. And this is very much like that secure attachment we saw in childhood, where these adults enjoy emotional closeness with their partner, but they are also fine being independent. So they enjoy spending time with their partner. They're happy to see them, but they're also perfectly self-sustaining. They could get on fine if they had to be on their own for a while. We also have an anxious or preoccupied attachment, and this is where that individual wants constant intimacy, constant contact. They avoid independence. They don't want to be on their own. They always want to be together. And they would resist separation, just like the similar attachment style in childhood. And then our last type here is the dismissive or avoidant attachment style. And this is when an adult prefers independence and tries to avoid relationships. So even if they are in a relationship, if they have a partner, they might prefer to be on their own. They might prefer to be distant. Or some people might choose not to have a partner at all. They would fall under this type of attachment style. And there's lots of research, fairly recently, in fact, about how these types of attachment styles in adulthood relate to those that we had when we were in childhood. And there are quite a few parallels where our attachment style as children tends to be fairly closely related to our attachment style as adults, but not always. There is the possibility to change and grow and have a different, more healthy attachment style as we get older. When we look at sort of our descriptions of life, and specifically our adulthood part of our journey through life, a lot of texts focus on some of the major life milestones. And for adulthood, the three big ones are marriage, parenthood, and retirement. And these are going to be very dependent on sort of where in the world you are, on what your societal views are on all of these qualities. Maybe it's expected that you get married young, or maybe it's more acceptable that you could get married later in life. But we're finding that a lot more recently, we're seeing a move away from sort of cultural norms about appropriate times for these key life events. So we might still have some idea that you should probably get married in your 20s or 30s, and if you wait until your 40s, that might be too long. But it's becoming more acceptable is the word I was looking for, to have non-normative behavior. So not getting married until you're much older, or maybe not getting married at all. Common law couples are a lot more common nowadays, so marriage doesn't really factor into that. Things like parenthood, the same thing, where some people are choosing to be parents and others are choosing not to be parents. And then with retirement, especially with current economic situations, some people aren't able to retire. So retirement isn't necessarily that solid life milestone that everyone views it as in a lot of textbooks. So our text does a good job and makes note that some of these milestones aren't as solid as we might have thought, and we're seeing a lot more of a movement towards non-normative behavior in relation to these different milestones. That being said, a lot of research has been conducted on how these different events can affect people's lives. So with marriage, there's a bunch of different research that typically shows that a happy marriage tends to contribute to health and well-being, Whereas an unhappy marriage, if people are not happy in their marriage, they tend to have reduced health and well-being, and it can even lead to a lower life expectancy. So that's going to be a trend that we see through a lot of these things, where if you are doing something that you enjoy, we see more health benefits and longer life expectancy. And if there are problems in that particular event, then you see the exact opposite. And the same with parenthood. So parenthood is one of those things that can be a positive factor or a negative factor in people's lives. It has a major effect on marriage. So for those who get married and then have children, if they have children and it causes strain on the relationship, it can actually cause unhappiness in a marriage. But there can also be positive emotions and sort of a gleaning of meaning to their lives associated with parenthood. So the research is very complex here, and again, it can go either in a positive or negative direction for people depending on how they experience it. And then with retirement, again, we see that if they've been able to successfully put away enough money to retire and live the kind of life that they had wanted, then retirement can be a beneficial situation. They can be happier and healthier. But there's also the potential for issues. If maybe they don't have enough finances set aside, then they could be under financial strain that causes stress and unhappiness. Maybe they get sedentary, they don't have hobbies, they don't have things to do, and so they get sort of closed off and isolated, and that can be unhappy. So again, both sides of the coin here, retirement can be really good for people, or it can be really bad for people, depending on how they experience it. And I do want to very briefly mention a particular theory called the socio-emotional selectivity theory. And this basically looks at how we frame events as we get older. So this is a theory, I'm going to just read the quote here. It's a theory on aging. So it specifies that one's perception of time impacts selection and pursuit of goals. So what they mean there is that if you're looking at your life and you're young and you have many, many years ahead of you, you're looking at, oh, there's lots of time to do things. So you're going to set your goals and pursue the goals that you deem important when you have lots of time left. As you get older and as you see that you are getting closer and closer to the end of your life, that impending sort of end of time is going to change your perspective. It's going to change your priorities and get you to focus on other aspects, other goals in your life. So younger adults tend to favor information-related goals. So they try and gain information, they try to learn new things, they try to sort of do things that relate to gathering and using information. And as you get older, we start favoring emotion-related goals, things that are tied to their well-being and relationships. So maybe they're going to focus less on work and trying to get ahead and be the best at their job. Maybe now they just want to be happy in their job and want to find people they enjoy spending time with. This allows older individuals to have a better capacity for emotional regulation. They are more emotionally stable and they care about their own well-being. They can also try to avoid negatively arousing stimuli. So they avoid things that make them upset, and they focus on maintaining satisfying relationships. So maybe you've seen the idea of older people who no longer care about people's opinions. They're going to cut people out of their lives and they only care about what makes them happy. That ties into this theory where they stop caring about appearances and pleasing everyone, and they just focus on their own emotional well-being and their own happiness as they get older. And then the last topic I wanted to touch on for this section isn't actually something exclusive to adulthood and old age. This is actually a lifespan perspective on development. So this is Erikson's 8 stages of development. So this brings us all the way back to infancy again, but then it's going to run from infancy through to old age. So this is, instead of us focusing in, zeroing in on each stage separately and looking at theories that apply only only to one stage. This is now a new theory proposed by Erikson to look at how we handle different milestones as we age across our whole lifespan. And so Erikson focused on the idea that starting in infancy, we're going to encounter and try to master different developmental challenges. So we're going to be faced by these developmental milestones. And there are two possible outcomes. So in infancy, we're faced with sort of this face-off between trust and mistrust. And if you succeed, if you pass this milestone, then you learn to trust your caretaker and you trust the world around them. And if you don't sort of pass this milestone, you develop a sense of mistrust. So you don't trust your caregivers, you don't trust your surroundings, and that can lead to problems in the future. Our next milestone here is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So this is in our early childhood when we're quite young. And if you pass this milestone, if you succeed at this sort of conflicting challenge, then you would become more confident in your ability to make decisions and survive in the world. Children gain a sense of autonomy. They feel like they have control in their lives and that what they do matters. If they don't reach that milestone, then children believe that they aren't able to make good decisions on their own. So maybe they have a parental figure who tells them that they're not making the right decision, they always do things wrong, so they might gain this feeling of shame and doubt where they don't trust their own actions. And then our next one is a little bit later on with initiative versus guilt. So do you have this feeling of purpose or initiative? Do these children develop a intentional wanting to do things, wanting to accomplish things? They want to learn things and do things and try things. Or do they develop a sense of guilt and see themselves as more of a nuisance to others? Do they want to stay away from people and not sort of expand into their world and try and learn things and find their purpose? And so we can keep going through these, but I'm actually just going to let you read these ones instead of going through all of them. They're pretty standard. We have industry versus inferiority. Then we can scroll over to identity versus role confusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, and ego identity versus despair. So each of these sort of choices or diverging pathways comes to us at different stages in our lives, and the outcome of how we face those challenges will shape how we view ourselves and how we interact with the world. So to be your best self, you should be able to pass all of these milestones. And then if you don't, you encounter issues. So picking one of these at random, if you aren't able to pass this generativity versus stagnation, you no longer, you sort of start feeling stuck and unfulfilled and unproductive. You stagnate and don't feel like there's meaning. You don't feel like you belong and contribute to the world around you. So there's a lot of these to go through, 8 in fact, but they're sort of logically presented, so I'm not going to go through each of them.